3 world-class medical specialists sprinted through the gilded double doors of the Orlando penthouse as if the building were on the verge of exploding. The first, a renowned cardiologist from Zurich, was clutching a broken stethoscope and sobbing so hysterically she nearly collided with the elevator doors. The second, a trauma surgeon who had worked in active combat zones, walked out in a daze, his hands trembling and his eyes fixed in a 1,000-yard stare as if he had just seen a ghost. The third, a high-priced psychiatrist, was already frantically dialing her legal team, screaming into her phone about hazard pay, workplace violence, and the fact that no amount of money was worth dealing with a beast in human skin. She didn't even wait for the elevator, she took the emergency stairs, her heels clicking a rhythmic, panicked retreat down the marble hallway. Lily Taylor walked past them, her movements steady and her expression unreadable. She wore a white coat that had been laundered so many times the elbows were thinning, and her blue scrubs were a shade faded, but they were pressed sharp. While the prestigious doctors before her had carried designer leather briefcases, Lily held a single, battered medical bag that had seen better decades. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder, watching the chaos with the clinical detachment of someone who had lived through a different kind of war. To the others, the man inside was a career-ending nightmare. To Lily, he was a paycheck that meant the difference between her sister's surgery and a funeral. The Orlando penthouse felt less like a home and more like a high-security fortress. Armed men in charcoal suits stood at every junction, their hands hovering near holstered weapons, their eyes scanning Lily with a mixture of pity and cold suspicion. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the metallic tang of something sterilized, yet rotting. Lily didn't flinch as she passed a guard who looked like he could crush her with one hand. She had spent the last 3 years in underfunded city ERs, she had been spat on, swung at, and cursed out by the best. A mafia boss with a bad attitude didn't even make her top 10 list of concerns. At the entrance to the primary suite stood a man named Silas, the Orlando family's cleaner. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life burying secrets and the people who kept them. He held a clipboard with a stack of papers so thick it looked like a small novel. Silas looked Lily up and down, noting the frayed edges of her sleeves and the way she stood, not with the arrogance of the doctors who had preceded her, but with the quiet resilience of a woman who had already been broken and put herself back together. He asked if she was the intern the agency had sent in desperation. Lily met his gaze without blinking and confirmed her name. Silas didn't offer a hand. Instead, he flipped to the final page of the clipboard. He asked if she had read the terms of the Orlando non-disclosure and liability waiver. Lily nodded. He pressed further, asking if she understood the clause regarding unforeseeable physical expiration and the total indemnity for psychological scarring. Lily leaned in slightly, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, though it never reached her tired eyes. She told him she found the part about total indemnity particularly poetic. Silas didn't smile back. He told her that Madden Orlando was not just a patient, he was a hurricane. Lily asked if he was the type of hurricane that threw tantrums over the temperature of his soup or the type that threw the doctor through the window. Silas replied that Madden had gone through 7 female doctors in the last 6 days, and that didn't include the 2 who had suffered nervous breakdowns before they even saw his face. Lily adjusted her bag, her voice calm and level. She said that setting a world record for being impossible was actually quite an achievement. Silas warned her that this wasn't a game. Lily looked at the heavy oak doors, behind which a muffled roar of glass shattering echoed through the hall. She told him she knew it wasn't a joke. But if she didn't find a way to stay professional, she'd have to start worrying about her own sanity, and she didn't have the time or the budget for a mental health day. She had one job to do, and as long as Madden Orlando still had a pulse, she was going to take it. Silas sighed, a sound of genuine exhaustion, and stepped aside. He told her that the clock started the moment she crossed the threshold. If she lasted an hour, she'd already be doing better than the surgeon from Harvard. Lily didn't wait for further instructions. She pushed the heavy doors open and stepped into the dim, heavy atmosphere of the master suite. The room was a wreck. A state-of-the-art medical monitor lay smashed against the far wall, its screen a spiderweb of cracked glass. In the center of the room stood Madden Orlando. He was tall, his muscular frame draped in a white dress shirt that had been torn open, revealing a torso mapped in scars and tattoos. His arm was wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage that looked like it had been applied in a fit of rage rather than care. He turned toward the door, his veins bulging in his neck, his eyes radiating a raw, animalistic fury. He didn't see a doctor. He saw another intruder. He pointed a trembling, blood-stained finger at her and shouted for her to get out before he gave her a reason to never walk again. The sheer volume of his voice would have sent most people stumbling backward. Lily Taylor didn't move. She didn't scream, and she didn't look for the exit. Instead, she pulled a digital thermometer from her pocket and checked her watch. She looked at the man who was currently the most feared figure in the city's underworld and told him that his blood pressure was clearly high, but if he kept shouting, he was going to trigger a stroke before she could even get his vitals. She asked him to sit down so they could begin, or he could keep yelling and save the city the trouble of assassinating him. For the first time in his life, Madden Orlando was silenced by pure shock. He stared at the small woman in the faded scrubs, his chest heaving, his fury momentarily eclipsed by the realization that for once, he was looking at someone who wasn't afraid of the devil. Before we go further, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you want to see more of this. It means the world to me, and don't forget to tell me in the comment section where you are watching from. The heavy iron gates had grown shut behind Lily with a finality that echoed through the quiet, tree-lined street, sealing her into the Orlando estate. As she followed the winding driveway toward the monolith of glass and black marble that served as the family's stronghold, the air seemed to grow colder, thick with a tension that made the skin on her neck prickle. She didn't look back. There was nothing for her back there, only a pile of medical school debt and the sound of her sister's shallow, struggling breaths. She was met at a side entrance by a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and left in a basement for several decades. This was Silas. He didn't smile, and his eyes held the weary, flat look of a man who had seen every possible way a human body could be broken. He didn't lead her to a grand foyer. Instead, he ushered her into a sterile, windowless office that smelled of ozone and old paper. It felt like a transition chamber between the world of the living and whatever existed inside the heart of the Orlando Empire. Silas sat behind a desk that was completely empty except for a thick manila folder. He tapped it with a scarred index finger. He told her that before she saw him, before she even learned the layout of the halls, she had to understand the price of entry. He opened the folder to reveal a document printed on heavy, cream-colored parchment that looked more like a treaty than a medical contract. Lily scanned the first page. It wasn't a standard employment agreement. It was a comprehensive surrender of rights. The language was cold and clinical, detailing her responsibilities to the patient, but the fine print was where the true story lay. It mentioned voluntary assumption of extreme risk and non-disclosure of illegal trauma. It explicitly stated that the Orlando family would not be held liable if she suffered psychological fragmentation, permanent physical disability, or termination of life. She noticed a small, brownish smudge on the corner of the signature page. It looked like a dried bloodstain, likely a souvenir from one of the doctors who had fled earlier that morning. Silas watched her, his hands folded. He told her that most people stopped reading at the third paragraph. He asked if she realized that by signing, she was effectively becoming a ghost, that if she disappeared inside these walls, the paperwork was designed to ensure the world never asked where she went. He spoke with the cadence of a cemetery groundskeeper explaining the rules of the graveyard. He wasn't trying to scare her, he was stating facts. Lily picked up the heavy fountain pen resting on the desk. She thought about her sister, Rosie, and the way her lungs sounded like dry leaves rattling in the wind. She thought about the $200,000 she needed for the transplant, a sum she would never earn in a lifetime of residency. She told Silas that she had already signed her life away to the hospital board for pennies an hour, so she might as well do it for a man who could actually pay the bill. She didn't hesitate as she pressed the nib to the paper. Her signature was steady, a sharp contrast to the trembling scrawls of the names listed above hers on the previous agency sheets. When she finished, Silas took the paper and blew on the ink. He told her that her courage was either very brave or very stupid, and in this house, there wasn't much difference between the two. He stood up, the keys on his belt jingling like a funeral dirge, and told her it was time to meet the man she had just sold her soul to save. As they walked toward the elevator, Lily felt the weight of the contract in her mind, a blood-stained promise that there was no going back. She had officially entered the devil's territory, and the rules of the outside world no longer applied. The heavy oak doors groaned as they swung open, revealing a master suite that looked more like a site of a recent explosion than a bedroom. Shards of a shattered crystal decanter caught the dim light, sparkling like jagged diamonds across the Persian rug. The air was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the copper tang of fresh blood. Standing in the center of the wreckage was a man who seemed too large for the room, his presence pressing against the walls with a raw, suffocating energy. Madden Orlando was a vision of controlled chaos. He stood with his back to the door, his massive shoulders heaving under a white dress shirt that was shredded at the sleeve, revealing skin mapped in dark ink and corded muscle. A makeshift bandage was tied haphazardly around his bicep, soaked through with a deep, alarming crimson. He didn't turn around immediately, but the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as he realized someone had dared to enter his sanctuary. When he finally turned, the sheer force of his gaze was enough to make Lily's heart hammer against her ribs. His face was a mask of jagged angles and stubble, his eyes burning with a fevered, animalistic rage. He didn't see a doctor, he saw a target. He grabbed a heavy brass lamp from a side table and hurled it against the wall inches from Lily's head. The crash was deafening, but Lily didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply shifted her medical bag to her other shoulder and watched him with a calm, clinical curiosity. Madden's voice was a low, guttural growl that vibrated in the floorboards. He asked her if she had a death wish or if she was simply too stupid to hear the warnings of the cowards who had fled before her. He began to pace, his movements predatory and restless, the veins in his neck bulging as he roared that he didn't want a doctor, he didn't want a nurse, and he certainly didn't want a girl who looked like she would break if he raised his voice. He stopped just 3 feet from her, his towering frame casting a shadow that swallowed her whole. He smelled of sweat and infection, a sign that his wound was far worse than the reports had suggested. He raised a hand, pointing a finger stained with his own blood toward the door. He told her she had 30 seconds. 30 seconds to turn around and run back to her mediocre life before he made sure she never practiced medicine again, or never walked again. Lily checked the digital watch on her wrist, her thumb clicking the timer. She looked up at him, meeting the fire in his eyes with the coolness of deep water. She told him that 30 seconds was plenty of time, but she would prefer to use it to discuss his mounting sepsis rather than his threats. She noted that his pupils were dilated and his skin was flushed, suggesting a fever of at least 103 degrees. She told him he could spend his remaining 20 seconds shouting, but if he did, he would likely lose consciousness before the minute was up. Madden froze, his hand still hovering in the air. No one had ever spoken to him as if he were a specimen under a microscope. He looked at her small, defiant form, her neat hair, her faded blue scrubs, and the absolute lack of fear in her expression. The silence that followed was heavier than the shouting had been. Lily didn't move an inch. She just watched the timer on her wrist, waiting for the beast to decide if he was going to kill her or let her save him. As the seconds ticked down, the raw fury in his eyes flickered, replaced for a fleeting second by a spark of genuine, shocked intrigue. He had tried to break her with a storm, but she was the only thing in the room that hadn't moved. Madden stared at the digital timer on Lily's wrist as if it were a ticking bomb. The silence in the room was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of his intimidation, it had transformed into something sharp and calculated. He had expected her to break, to stammer an apology, or to flee like the others. Instead, she stood there with the cool indifference of a statue, her thumb hovering over the start button of a handheld stopwatch she had pulled from her scrub pocket. With a grunt of pure disbelief, Madden threw himself back into the leather armchair, the springs groaning under his massive weight. He told her that since she was so fond of rules, he would give her a set she couldn't handle. He declared that from this moment forward, she was not to speak unless spoken to, and even then, she had exactly 5 seconds to deliver any medical information. If she went a second over, or if she spoke out of turn, he would have Silas toss her off the balcony. He looked at her with a predatory smirk, waiting for the flicker of indignation. Lily didn't give it to him. Instead, she clicked the stopwatch. The mechanical click echoed in the wreckage of the suite. She moved toward him with a tray of antiseptic and fresh bandages. Madden watched her every move, his muscles tensed and ready to spring. He waited for her to ask him to move his arm. He waited for her to complain about the mess. She did neither. She simply pointed to his blood-soaked sleeve and then to the scissors in her hand. Madden narrowed his eyes but slowly extended his arm, his jaw tight. "Why aren't you talking, doctor?" he sneered, leaning into her personal space so closely she could feel the heat radiating from his feverish skin. "Lost your nerve now that the clock is running?" Lily hit the button on her watch. Click. "You're wound as septic," she said, her voice a flat, rapid-fire monotone. "I am Deb writing it." Click. "Exactly 4 seconds. Madden's smirk faltered. He watched the timer. He tried to catch her off guard again, asking her a complex question about the long-term effects of the antibiotics she was preparing. He expected her to stumble, to lose track of time as she explained the pharmacology. Lily didn't even look up from the vial. She waited until the needle was ready, then hit the watch. "Broad-spectrum coverage prevents organ failure," she stated, the syllables clipped and precise. "Hold your breath for the injection." Click. 4.8 seconds. The afternoon wore on in a bizarre dance of malicious compliance. Madden grew increasingly agitated, his fury replaced by a mounting frustration that he couldn't provoke a single emotional crack in her exterior. He intentionally knocked a tray of gauze out of her hand, expecting a gasp or a protest. Lily simply picked them up, reset her watch, and waited for him to speak so she could justify the time it took to resanitize them. He told her she was a robot, a hollow shell of a woman who probably didn't have a pulse of her own. He mocked the cheapness of her shoes and the way her hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful. He was fishing for a human reaction, a sign that his words could cut deeper than her scalpel. Lily waited until she was finished taping the final bandage. She stood up, adjusted her bag, and looked him directly in the eye. She didn't hit the watch this time because he hadn't asked a question. She simply stood in front of him, the stopwatch visible in her palm, its screen blank and ready. Madden looked from the watch to her face, his chest heaving. He asked her, through gritted teeth, what she was waiting for. Click. I am waiting for your fever to break, she said, her voice calm and unwavering. And for you to realize that I am the only person in this building who isn't afraid of your noise. Click. 3.9 seconds. She turned and walked toward the door, leaving the most feared man in the city sitting in stunned silence, staring at the empty space where a poor intern had just won a war of wills without breaking a single one of his rules. The following evening, the atmosphere in the penthouse was thick with the scent of rain and the heavy, metallic tang of Madden's simmering resentment. He was sitting by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights reflecting in the glass like a sea of distant fire. He had been brooding since Lily entered, his gaze fixed on her battered medical bag and the way she meticulously laid out her supplies. The silence was brittle, and Madden was clearly looking for a way to shatter it. He waited until she approached him with a fresh dressing before he let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He looked at her shoes, the scuffed, generic brand sneakers that had been glued back together at the heel, and then at the way she carefully squeezed every last drop of ointment from the tube. He asked her if the medical agency paid her in buttons or if she was just naturally fond of looking like a charity case. He gestured vaguely at the opulence around them, the Italian marble, the silk curtains, the gold leaf detailing, and told her it must be exhausting to walk through a palace every day knowing she'd go home to a shoebox that smelled like damp laundry and failure. He leaned forward, his muscular chest straining against his shirt, his eyes narrow and cruel. He told her he could smell the desperation on her, the kind that only comes from someone who counts their pennies before they buy a loaf of bread. He called her a bottom feeder, a girl who was only playing at being a doctor because she was too poor to have any real pride. He expected her to flinch, to look away in shame, or perhaps to finally lose that infuriatingly calm composure. Lily didn't stop her work. She didn't even pause. She finished taping the bandage with surgical precision before she finally looked up at him. She didn't look angry, she looked bored. She told him that he was right, she was poor. She told him she had lived in a car for 6 months while finishing her medical rotations, and that she had learned to perform stitches by the light of a flickering street lamp because she couldn't afford a flashlight. She stood up and walked over to the large, ornate mirror that Madden had cracked during a previous outburst. She pointed to her reflection, then to his. She told him that he thought his money made him a god, but from where she was standing, he was just a man who was terrified of a tiny needle. She said she had seen real hell, the kind that doesn't come from a mafia hit or a territorial dispute, but the kind where you have to choose which sister gets to eat that night. She told him about the night her parents died in a hallway of an overcrowded public hospital because they didn't have the Orlando name to get them a private room. She leaned in, her face inches from his, her voice a low, steady hum that cut through his arrogance like a blade. She told him that his insults were nothing compared to the silence of a house where no one is left to scream. She said she wasn't here for his respect or his approval, she was here for the money that would keep her sister's heart beating, and there was nothing he could say that was uglier than the reality she had already conquered. Madden's mouth tightened, the mocking smirk disappearing into a hard, straight line. For the first time, he didn't look at her like a nuisance or a servant. He looked at her like a mirror, one that showed him a reflection of a soul that was just as scarred and battle-hardened as his own. He didn't say another word as she packed her bag and walked out, but the echo of her hell remained in the room, louder than any shout he had ever produced. The following night, the penthouse was eerily silent, devoid of the usual crashing glass or shouted threats. When Lily pushed open the heavy oak doors, she wasn't met with a predatory glare or a mocking comment. Instead, the room was sweltering, the thermostat pushed to its limit, and the air was heavy with the sweet, cloying scent of a fever that had finally spiraled out of control. She found Madden near the balcony doors, his massive frame slumped against the glass. He had tried to get up, perhaps to find water or to vent his frustration at the sky, but his legs had betrayed him. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering with a rhythmic, metallic sound, and his skin was a terrifying shade of ashen gray. The beast was gone, replaced by a man crumbling under the weight of his own stubbornness. Lily dropped her bag and was at his side in seconds. As she struggled to shift his dead weight to get him onto his back, her hand brushed against something hard and cold tucked into the waistband of his trousers. It wasn't a weapon, it was a small, tarnished silver locket. The chain snapped as if it had been pulled off someone's neck in a struggle. While she worked with frantic efficiency, ripping open his shirt to apply cooling packs and prepping a high dose of antibiotics, the locket fell open on the carpet. Inside was a grainy, salt-stained photograph of a young woman with a smile that looked exactly like the one Madden tried so hard to bury under his rage. Beside her was a younger Madden, his face clean of scars, his arm draped protectively around her. Scrawled on the back in fading ink were the words, "Forgive me for leaving first." Lily paused for only a heartbeat, the clinical wall she had built around herself cracking. This was the source of the infection, not the one in his arm, but the one in his soul. Madden's hand suddenly shot out, his fingers trembling as they clamped around her wrist with the last of his strength. His eyes rolled back in his head, his pupils blown wide with delirium. He didn't see Lily. He looked through her, his voice a broken, raspy whisper that sounded like it was being dragged over broken glass. He called out a name, Sophia, and begged her not to get in the car. He pleaded with the empty air, his grip tightening until Lily's bones groaned. He whispered that it should have been him, that he was the one who deserved the fire, the one who deserved to be left in the dark. Lily didn't pull away. She let him hold her wrist, using her free hand to gently brush the sweat-soaked hair from his forehead. She realized then that his rules, the no talking, the no touching, the 30-second warnings, weren't about power. They were about distance. He was terrified that if anyone got close enough to see the wound in the photo, he wouldn't be able to stay the monster he needed to be to survive. She leaned down, her voice a soft, steady anchor in the storm of his seizure. She told him that Sophia wasn't there, but she was. She told him he wasn't going to follow her into the dark, not tonight, and not on her shift. As the sedative she injected began to take hold, Madden's grip finally loosened, his hand falling limp to the floor near the silver locket. He slipped into a deep, drug-induced sleep, his breathing finally leveling out. Lily sat on the floor beside him for a long time, the locket resting in her palm. She had come here to save a boss so she could save her sister, but as she looked at the broken man before her, she realized she was the only person who knew that the most dangerous man in the city was actually just a ghost haunting his own life. The first gray light of dawn filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the dust motes in the room into drifting specks of silver. Madden stirred, his consciousness returning in slow, agonizing waves. His head felt like it had been filled with lead, and his arm throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, but the searing, white-hot fire of the fever had finally receded into a manageable simmer. He expected to find himself alone in the wreckage of his suite, left to rot by yet another doctor who had seen the monster and fled. Instead, his eyes landed on a small, slumped figure in a chair by his bedside. Lily Taylor was fast asleep, her head tilted at an awkward angle against the leather wingback. She was still wearing the faded blue scrubs, but her white coat was draped over her lap like a makeshift blanket. Her breathing was soft and rhythmic, her face devoid of the clinical mask she wore during the day. In the soft light, she didn't look like a defiant intern or a bottom feeder, she just looked exhausted. Madden's gaze drifted to his own hand. On the nightstand, resting right next to his glass of water, was the silver locket. It was clean, the dried blood wiped away, and the broken chain had been carefully laid out in a straight line. He didn't shout. He didn't demand to know why she was still there or threaten to throw her out for touching his personal belongings. The raw, jagged fury that usually fueled his every breath felt strangely absent, replaced by a hollow, quiet confusion. He sat up slowly, the silk sheets rustling, and watched her. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes and the way her fingers, even in sleep, seemed curled as if she were still holding a vial of medicine. Lily's eyes snapped open all at once, the instinct of a hospital intern kicking in. She didn't jump or gasp, she simply straightened her back and looked at him, her eyes immediately scanning his face for signs of neurological distress. She reached for the thermometer on the nightstand, her movements fluid and practiced. Madden watched her approach. Usually, this was the part where he would roar about his privacy or mock her for her persistence. But as she pressed the back of her hand to his forehead to check his temperature, a move that was decidedly not in his rulebook, the words died in his throat. Her skin was cool, a stark contrast to the heat still radiating from his. He asked her, his voice a low, raspy shadow of its usual volume, why she hadn't left. He pointed to the clock, which showed she was hours past the end of her shift. He reminded her that Silas would have paid her regardless, and that he had given her every reason to walk away and never look back. Lily didn't look at the clock. She checked the 4 drips she had started in the middle of the night and adjusted the flow rate. She told him that she didn't leave because his heart rate had spiked to 140 at 3 in the morning and she didn't feel like filling out the paperwork for a dead patient. She said it was a matter of professional pride, nothing more. Madden looked at the locket, then back at her. He didn't mention Sophia. He didn't thank her. But for the first time since she had walked through those heavy oak doors, the air in the room didn't feel like a battlefield. He leaned back against the pillows, his tensed shoulders finally dropping an inch. He told her she looked like hell. Lily offered a small, genuine smile, the first one that actually reached her eyes. She told him that he looked worse, but at least he wasn't shouting anymore. The silence that followed wasn't the brittle, dangerous quiet of the previous days. It was a truce, fragile, unspoken, and built on the ruins of a long night. Madden didn't tell her to get out, and Lily didn't reach for her stopwatch. For a moment, they weren't a boss and a servant, or a beast and a doctor. They were just 2 people who had survived the dark together, waiting for the sun to finish rising. The fragile peace of the morning was shattered not by a shout, but by the sharp, rhythmic click of designer heels echoing down the marble hallway. Lily was in the middle of checking Madden's pulse, her fingers resting lightly on his wrist, when the double doors were flung open without a knock. Silas tried to step in to intervene, but he was brushed aside by a woman who moved with the predatory grace of a panther. She was draped in crimson silk that cost more than Lily's medical degree, her hair a sleek curtain of midnight black, and her eyes as cold and sharp as polished flint. This was Bianca Moretti, the daughter of a rival syndicate head and a woman whose history with Madden was written in both blood and broken promises. She didn't look at Madden first. Instead, her gaze landed on Lily, raking over her faded scrubs and tired eyes with a look of profound disgust. Bianca let out a soft, mocking laugh that sounded like glass breaking. She asked Madden if he had truly fallen so far that he was letting a stray, middle-class servant handle his recovery. She walked deeper into the room, the scent of her cloying, expensive perfume drowning out the sterile smell of the antiseptics. She ignored the wreckage of the suite, stepping over a shattered lamp as if it were nothing more than a stray leaf. Madden's jaw tightened, the cords in his neck leaping into prominence. The calmness Lily had spent all night cultivating evaporated in a heartbeat. He didn't look at Bianca with affection, he looked at her with a weary, deep-seated loathing. He told her she was a long way from her father's territory and asked what vulture business brought her to his bedside. Bianca didn't flinch. She reached out to touch the bandage Lily had just applied, her long, manicured nails digging slightly into the gauze. She whispered that she had heard the great Madden Orlando was finally dying, and she wanted to see if the rumors were true before the rest of the city started carving up his corpse. She then turned her venom back toward Lily, asking the little nurse if she knew she was wasting her time. She told Lily that Madden wasn't a man who could be healed, he was a black hole that swallowed everything good until there was nothing left but dust. Lily felt the temperature in the room shift. Madden's breathing was becoming ragged, his blood pressure likely skyrocketing. She stepped between Bianca and the bed, her small frame a sharp barrier against the woman's crimson elegance. She didn't raise her voice, but she didn't move an inch. She told Bianca that her patient was currently under strict medical observation and that vultures were not permitted during visiting hours. Bianca's eyes flashed with a dangerous light. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of peppermint and malice. She told Lily that in this world, doctors were a dime a dozen, but the Orlando name was a death sentence. She warned her that by standing so close to him, she was painting a target on her own back, one that no amount of medical insurance could cover. Madden's hand suddenly shot out, grabbing Bianca's wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a man who had just survived a septic fever. He didn't pull her closer, he pushed her away. He told her that if she spoke to Lily again, he would ensure her father received her back in pieces. His voice was low and lethal, the beast returning not to attack Lily, but to protect her. Bianca straightened her silk dress, her expression souring. She looked at the two of them, the scarred boss and the poor intern standing in his shadow, and realized the dynamic had changed. She told Madden he was making a mistake by trusting a girl who had nothing to her name. With a final, lingering glare at Lily, she turned on her heel and marched out, the click of her heels sounding like a countdown to a war that was no longer just about territory, but about the woman who had dared to heal the devil. The sky over the city had turned a bruised, sickly purple when the first explosion rocked the penthouse. The impact didn't just rattle the windows, it shattered the fragile sense of security Lily had begun to feel within the black marble walls. The lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the entire suite into a suffocating, absolute darkness. In the sudden silence that followed, the rapid-fire chatter of automatic weapons erupted from the hallway, the high-pitched whistle of a siege. Madden was on his feet before Lily could even process the sound. Despite the lingering weakness in his limbs, the predator in him had taken over. He lunged for her in the dark, his massive hand finding her shoulder and shoving her down behind the reinforced mahogany desk just as a spray of glass rained over the room. He didn't shout or roar, he moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. He pulled a heavy handgun from a hidden compartment under the desk, his breathing heavy but controlled. He looked at her in the strobing light of distant muzzle flashes, his eyes flashing with that familiar animalistic fire. He told her to stay down, to crawl toward the bathroom where the walls were thickest. But as he turned to move toward the door, a low, wet groan escaped his lips, and he collapsed against the side of the desk. The exertion had torn the healing tissue of his wound, and a fresh, warm surge of blood began to soak through his shirt. Lily didn't crawl away. She heard the heavy boots of the attackers in the hallway and the shouts of Silas's men holding the line, but her focus was entirely on the man bleeding out on the carpet. She reached into her bag, her fingers finding her penlight by touch. She clicked it on, the narrow beam of light cutting through the smoke-filled air. Madden's face was deathly pale, his eyes unfocused. The internal sutures had failed, he was hemorrhaging. She told him he had to lie flat, her voice a sharp, commanding whip that brooked no argument. Madden tried to push her away, his voice a raspy snarl telling her to save herself. Lily ignored him. She pinned his good shoulder with her weight and told him that if he didn't let her work, he'd be dead before the intruders even reached the door. Working by the dim, flickering light of her penlight held between her teeth, Lily transformed the floor behind the desk into a makeshift operating theater. The world outside was a chaotic symphony of screaming metal and gunfire, but inside the small circle of her light, there was only the task. She didn't have a sterile field or a proper surgical suite. She had a bottle of high-proof bourbon from the wreckage, a sewing kit she carried for emergencies, and the steady hands of a woman who had already seen her world end once. She poured the alcohol over his wound and her own hands, the smell of spirits and iron filling her lungs. Madden gripped the edge of the desk so hard the wood splintered, his body arching in agony as she worked to find the bleeder. Every time a grenade thudded nearby, the floor shook, threatening to ruin her precision. She didn't flinch. She focused on the rhythm of his failing pulse and the steady movement of her needle. She whispered to him, her voice a constant, grounding hum amidst the violence. She told him about the clinic she wanted to build, about the sister who was waiting for her, and about the man she saw behind the locket, the one who deserved a second chance. She was stitching more than just flesh, she was stitching a promise into his very skin. By the time Silas and the remaining guards burst into the room to clear the floor, the gunfire had faded to a distant echo. The emergency lights kicked on, bathing the room in a harsh, crimson glow. They found Lily Taylor slumped against the desk, her face splattered with blood and her hands stained to the wrists, still holding a pressure bandage over Madden's heart. Madden was unconscious but breathing, his pulse thready but stable. He had survived the attack, and he had survived the beast within. Lily looked up at the armed men, her eyes hollow but fierce. She told them the patient was stable, then finally allowed her own hands to tremble. She had operated in the dark, and for the first time in her life, she hadn't lost the person on the table. 6 months later, the Orlando penthouse no longer felt like a tomb of glass and marble. The heavy, oppressive scent of bourbon and antiseptic had been replaced by the smell of fresh rain and the clean, bright aroma of lemon verbena. The black stone hallways that once echoed with the terrified retreats of broken doctors were now filled with a quiet, industrious purpose. Madden Orlando stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city he had once dominated through fear. He was wearing a simple, well-tailored black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were still mapped in ink, but his posture was no longer that of a predator waiting to strike. It was the stance of a man who had finally stopped running from his own ghosts. Lily Taylor walked into the room without a stopwatch or a clipboard. She moved with a relaxed grace, her hair no longer pulled back in a severe, defensive knot. She found Madden staring at a blueprint spread across the mahogany desk, the same desk where she had once operated on him by the flicker of a penlight. The plans were not for a new warehouse or a gambling den. They were for the Taylor Orlando Medical Center, a free clinic in the heart of the city's most neglected district, specializing in the kind of emergency care that had failed her parents and Sophia. Madden turned as she approached, and the raw, animalistic fire in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, steady warmth. He didn't offer a 30-second warning. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the scar on her palm from that night under the scalpel. He told her that the construction was ahead of schedule and that her sister, Rosie, had been moved into the recovery wing of the best cardiac facility in the country, fully funded by the New Orlando Foundation. He admitted that for years, he thought the only way to honor the dead was to build a monument of fear around their memory. He had believed that being the beast was the only way to protect the few things he had left. But looking at Lily, the woman who had broken every one of his rules just to keep his heart beating, he realized that true power wasn't in the ability to take a life, but in the courage to save one. He was no longer interested in being the king of an underworld built on blood. He wanted to be a man who left something behind that didn't need to be buried. Lily leaned her head against his shoulder, looking out at the skyline. She told him that healing was a slow process, and that they both still had scars that would itch when the weather turned cold. She reminded him that redemption wasn't a destination they reached, but a choice they had to make every single morning when they woke up. Madden pulled the silver locket from his pocket. The chain had been expertly repaired, and the metal polished until it shone like new. He didn't hide it in his waistband this time. He placed it on the desk, right next to the clinic's blueprints. He told her that he used to think the locket was a weight, a reminder of a debt he could never pay. Now, it was a compass. As the sun began to set over the city, casting long, golden shadows across the room, the most feared man in the underworld and the poor intern who had refused to blink stood together in the light. They had both survived their own versions of hell, and in the wreckage of their past lives, they had found something neither of them thought they deserved, a future. The beast had been tamed, not by force or by fear, but by the quiet, stubborn resilience of a woman who knew that even the most ruthless heart is still just a heart, waiting for someone brave enough to listen to its beat. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye.